Welcome to Session 67 in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. This time around, we are going to be looking at these 4 books, and I don't say 4 novels because 2 of these are actually collections of short stories in the Witcher series by Andrzej Sapkowski. So we're looking at The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, both of which are short story collections. There's a little bit of confusingness, you could say, in how these come out. And then we're looking at the first 2 of the novels in the sequence, The Blood of Elves and Time of Contempt. And you might say, why aren't you doing the whole series? Well, we'll put off the other books until later on because this is already a lot of content to go through in a, roughly 90 to 100 minute video. So Worlds of Speculative Fiction is this series that we've been doing since 2016 and started out as a face-to-face sort of gathering to discuss interesting narrative worlds spanning multiple books by classic and contemporary authors in speculative fiction, fantasy, sci-fi, horror, among others. And every year I would give me some suggestions and then take the best suggestions, put them into a poll. And Sapkowski was actually a winner, not this last year, but the previous year. We did the poll in 2021, and this is a fan favorite, and I just didn't get to it by the end of 2022 in the sessions that we did do. So I said, well, we'll do this early in 2023. And I got my hands on, you notice that these are a little bit mismatched, right? These 2 are volumes that I bought at our local half-price books. And then these are from the Great Milwaukee Library System. And I started reading my way through these 2. And I was very pleasantly surprised because, when it comes to fan choices, you never know if it's going to be great stuff or not so great stuff, and this is indeed great fantasy fiction. There's so much going on in it, very cool character development, interesting ethical dimensions that get explored, the nature of magic, evil, goodness, human motives, and all sketched on this continent with lots of moving pieces, you could say. Indeed, a continent for which there is no definitive map, as we'll also talk about. So, we're going to go through the stories and the world building, some of the characters, some of the plot, some of the cool philosophical themes. We'll also talk about the biography of Sapkowski as a living writer, and where these books originated from and how they became the excellent series that they are in literature, and also adapted to some we could call it the big screen, but it's actually streaming video of a show as well. So settle in. We got some cool fantasy to discuss. Let's jump right away into giving you a little bit of a tidbit of the world that The Witcher and the other important characters, Yennefer, Dandelion, Ciri, also inhabit. Since this is Worlds of Speculative Fiction, we should talk about world building and the setting for all of these great short stories and novels, and just in this half of what we can call the Witcher saga up until this point. And I think it's useful to begin at the start with a comparison to somebody that Sapkowski often gets likened to, and that is J.R.R. Tolkien. And I think we could also bring in some comparison to George R.R. Martin and to Ursula K. Le Guin and to R. Scott Bakker in this respect. And there's many others we could talk about. These are the ones that come to mind for me. So why talk about Tolkien? So Tolkien, by contrast to George R. R. Martin, who talks about this in interviews, is often likened to be an architect. He has not only maps of all of Middle-earth set out that he has created himself, he has developed the cultures and their back histories and even their languages that they're going to be using. George R. R. Martin contrasted himself with, for example, the Song of Ice and Fire against Tolkien by saying, I'm a gardener, I plant seeds, and then I see how they grow and I nurture them. Actually, he kills off a lot of his seeds as well, quite notoriously, right? And so I'm not an architect like Tolkien who has, the world more or less, figured out, and there's not a lot of revelation along the way. And this got Martin into a bit of a pickle, apparently. It's part of why Song of Ice and Fire is so hard to finish up. He says that he plotted himself into some corners. We might also think about R. Scott Bakker, talking about fantasy novels and his second apocalypse, lots and lots of world building going on and actually getting play tested in D&D games for, over a decade, really about 2 decades before he starts developing his first novel and then, bringing them out in succession. And of course, there's new things that come about, exploring different territories, different lands that had been just mentioned or on the map, previously in later books. But, he's more of an architect in some ways. Now, what could we call Sapkowski? If George R. R. Martin is a gardener by his own lights, well, then Sapkowski would be a super gardener. There isn't even a map of the territory, or rather, the continent. Other people create maps, and then, Sapkowski will sometimes weigh in and say, yeah, that looks pretty good, great, but he didn't make a map for himself. And as we're going to see when we look at interviews, there's a lot of things just kind of developing. If Martin is a gardener who plants seeds, Sapkowski is the kind of gardener like myself in previous times who pirated plants, who would go and wander around and see something, an interesting kind of blackberry bush and be like, ooh, I'm taking that. That's coming back and I'll put it in my garden, and doing things along those lines, making prairies, just scattering seeds all over the place, not carefully planting them. And in a certain way, I brought up Ursula K. Leguin. In a certain way, according to her, what she did with Earthsea is similar. Now, of course, she did have a map, and in her interviews, she says quite famously, I had to write further stories because I wasn't sure who lived in that part and what was going on in that portion of the map. So I wrote the stories so I could fill it in for myself. This is different. The stories are driving the mapping, and the history of this continent is kind of hazy, there's a lot of, people say that this happened, and clearly there have been some things that took place, but are they exactly like the stories that are being told? No, not really. And so, there is a map, and I'm going to be linking to one of the, or maybe multiple better maps in the video description here. And I just want to talk about what we actually have. And I'm actually looking at one of the maps right now. So we have this continent, and it's a decently enclosed space with lots of varied cultures and monsters and humanoid races that are often at odds with each other. Some of whom are pursuing conquest, some of whom just want to be left alone. And it's, in Sapkowski's descriptions, it's a pretty well-developed world where it needs to be. There's a lot going on within this narrative universe. So we have, in the South, there's, we could call it an evil empire if we want, certainly expansionist. It's one of the states, Nilfgaard, that is now moving north, conquering territories along the way. Sort of like an imperialist Rome or something else along those lines. And then we have all of these northern countries, and there's borders, there's mountain borders, right? In the very north, you have the Dragon Mountains, and, later on we find out that there are people who live beyond the Dragon Mountains because there's, white dragons up there in the ice. But they speak, different languages, and they don't play a big role, certainly not in the early 4 books. And then we have other mountain ranges to the east, the Blue Mountains, the Fiery Mountains, the others in the south. There we go. The ones down in Nilfgaard. And these essentially border and block off this part of the continent from the desert wastes further east, right? So you can go in there, and there are peoples, there are cultures, there are even kingdoms, there's trade going on, but for the most part, you kind of stay out of that area. So we got, the southern kingdoms, the northern kingdoms, Nilfgaard dominating the south, and then we have this vast sea called the Great Sea, right? And there's also a North Sea further north, and there's islands called Skellige. There's other islands as well, including one which is particularly associated with sorcery and studying magic, which is quite important. And there's all sorts of other things going on as well. There's peninsulas. It's quite an interesting venue. And then, you go further north, you start getting into all these different kingdoms. So I'm just going to run through these names. Corvair and Povis, the Hengfors League, the kingdom of Aedirn, Temeria, Lyria, Rivia. Rivia is where Geralt is from, right? Verdun, Sintra. Sintra is going to play a major role. Sodden, major battles going on there. And then there's, all sorts of other things, Dol Angra, and there's forests, and there's marshes. And so, you've got the sort of typical fantasy setting. Now, one of the things that we have to talk about besides this north-south struggle, right? You've got these kingdoms in the north, and they're disunited, sometimes fighting with each other, jealous of their prerogatives. And you got wizards and mages and other magic users floating around, including witchers, right? And then you've got, various religious cults playing roles as well. But the continent is peopled by all sorts of, I'd mentioned, humanoid races. So, there are elves, there are dwarves, there are gnomes, there are halflings, there are dryads, and sometimes, even stranger creatures, doppelgangers who can change into, different forms. And it sounds like D&D, doesn't it, at that point? But there's some important differences. In Dungeons and Dragons, these were all races that could be played by people. And then there were bad races like, goblins and orcs and gnolls and all that, right? Well, in this world, these different races are, sometimes cooperating with each other, sometimes getting along, and sometimes at odds with each other. The human beings wound up in this area through something called, the conjunction of the spheres, this cataclysm that pushed worlds together and allowed different races to wind up within this world. And so, first you've got conflict between elves and dwarves and gnomes, and, things kind of get worked out. The elves learn how to use magic, And there's an elder speech that's also connected with this. And then the human beings will arrive, and there's different waves of them, and the human beings, really, here's the long and short of it. With some exceptions, the human beings more or less push the other races, the older races, into marginal areas, into ghettos and cities, discriminate against them, sometimes engage in pogroms, eliminating them even to the point of genocide. And the other races, fight back very often or try to subvert things. And yet at the same time, humans will also hire, dwarves to help them out with this or that, or gnomes to do the accounts or various things along those lines. And we get to see a lot of different interesting cultures being developed, in part because we're seeing things in large part through the eyes of Geralt of Rivia, or Geralt, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And somebody's going to correct me, but don't even bother because it doesn't matter, right? So why do we get to see things through his eyes? He's kind of an in-between character. He is a human who has been modified, who's been mutated, is often how they put it, through the use of not just various kinds of magic, but all sorts of herbs and poisons and other things to change him, giving him eyes that can see in the dark, for example, an incredible healing capacity, superhuman reflexes, the ability to use magic in certain ways. And he is bred in a terrible process that ends up killing most of the people, most of the children who the Witchers do this with, to become a Witcher, that is to become a hunter of monsters. And not all monsters. For example, in one story, Geralt is like, yeah, dragons, I don't do that, buddy, that's a different sort of thing. I deal with the noxious monsters that prey on human beings and perhaps even some of the other races as well. And so he's not quite human. He's definitely not one of the other races, but he can, be perceived by them as something other than human. And so he can go to places and travel with people who otherwise would do him in. Now, this doesn't always get him out of everything. He runs into bands of elves who try to, rob him, kill him, things like that. But we're able to learn a lot more about this world through his eyes. And so that's the setting that we've got. And if you want to, there's this word grimdark that gets used to talk about, for example, George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire, or R. Scott Bakker's, Second Apocalypse. This is a grimdark world. It's not a world that everything is bad in, right, by any means. There are many moments, even eras of understanding, of development, of love, of companionship. But there's also an awful lot of suffering and conflict and pain and loss and danger running throughout this world as well. So there's a lot of interesting moral reflections in the book communicated by the characters or thought of by the characters. There's growth that's going to happen in how they view things. But that is the setting for us. And we're going to learn a little bit more about this as we look at the interviews that Sapkowski has given, the things that he's said about his world. There isn't an awful lot of readily available biographical information about Andrzej Sapkowski out there, in part because he's a bit reticent about talking about his past, except for in interviews, giving some interesting details that more often have to do with his work and less often with his life as such. There is a big origin story that we'll narrate in just a bit about him as the author of the Witcher series, but we should start at the start. So he's a Polish author born in Lodz and that's where his parents will end up settling. He's born in 1948, so shortly after World War II, during which his father served in the Polish People's Army, which was on the eastern side, and his father actually, according to him, fought in the Battle of Berlin. There's a very bloody time, and a lot of reconstruction had to take place throughout the areas where the Soviet Union and, Nazi Germany and their allies had fought. And Poland was really at the heart of that. So he grows up in a Poland where things are being rebuilt. He also grows up in a family of readers where there are many, many books. There's not a ton of things to do, and reading is something that he gets into quite a lot. He goes to high school and then is going to go to University of Lodz, so he stays basically in town, and he studies economics. Why does he study economics? It's considered a safe field. And, safe field means not only you're going to get a job, but also it can keep you out of trouble with the political authorities as well. And he becomes he does a lot of different jobs. Eventually he becomes a sales representative, traveling around in Poland, but also to other countries, selling furs. And he does some marketing, and that's going to play a role, as he says, in the success of the Witcher series. And the story begins in 1985, and it has to do with a contest that's being held by this journal, Fantaskia, which was, quite popular. And, it's interesting because there's a lot of reflections in interviews about fantasy literature and whether it's for children, whether it's serious or not. And Sapkowski decides, his son, who is named Christoph, is a reader of this. He decides, I'm going to enter something. Now, he had been writing stories for quite some time, so this isn't his first story ever, but it's the first story in the Witcher sequence. So he writes a story called The Witcher, in which Geralt, is the point of view character, and it's, found in the books, right? In the very first of them, and it's the first story where there's a redoing of a motif, you could say, about the vampire, the Striga, the evil creature, who turns out not to be quite so evil after all if you're treating them the right way. But the right way isn't giving them a kiss or anything. It's actually fighting them till dawn and keeping them out of their crypt. So he sends this story in, and it wins. It wins third place. It doesn't win first place. And Sapkowski says, well, that's because they didn't think fantasy was really that serious of a thing. And it catches on. People like it. And readers are avid for this. And they're like, you should write some more stuff. So he does. He starts writing more and more. And, his son is into that as well. He wins some awards, the Janusz Zajel Awards for short stories, The Sword of Destiny, The Lesser of Two Evils. And so he's got a good, side gig going on, you could say. And he's moving more and more towards becoming a professional author, away from doing these jobs that are really just jobs, not his beloved career or anything like that. And he's getting to live the life as an author that he wants. Then in 1994, we see the publication of Blood of Elves, the first of the novels, the full novels about Geralt of Rivia and these other characters that are going to be so important. For example, Ciri, Triss Marigold, the other two characters that we've already been introduced to as pretty important, Dandelion, and the love of Geralt's life, Yennefer. So these are quite important. And, there were other houses out there that were interested in it, but it's this supernova that takes a chance. They're like, you can write novels. And interestingly, there weren't a lot of fantasy novels. As Sapkowski says, in the Anglo-Saxon world, the English-speaking world, there's tons of fantasy stuff. In Poland, not really, right? There's translations of things, but people aren't writing these things for the sake of writing them in Polish, soon to be translated in many, many other languages as well. And Blood of Elves wins the David Gennell Legend Award. It starts to get, his works are translated into many other languages, including English. He's already got a massive following in Poland and some of the closer countries. And then he starts impacting the English-speaking world as well. And he continues writing novels set in that same narrative universe all the way up to Lady of the Lake in 1999. So there's a well-developed body of, let's call it, you could call it Witcher, Geralt stuff, but you have to include all the other characters who are involved in it as well. In the meantime, he's going to do some other things as well. He creates a role-playing game called Eye of Eurydice in 1995. He publishes an essay on the world of King Arthur. And then there's another thing that has me fascinated. It doesn't appear to be translated at this point in time. I would love to be able to read it in the original or get my hands on a translation. Manuscript discovered in a dragon's cave, published in 2001. And what is this? This is an essay, a book-length essay on fantasy literature, looking at, of course, J.R. Tolkien, but people all the way up to George R.R. Martin. So, he's very cognizant about what's going on, you could say, in this genre. He will turn his attention away from The Witcher and into other things. The Hussite Saga, Tower of Fools in 2002, Warriors of God in 2004, Light Perpetual in 2006, set explicitly in Central Europe. He writes another novel, a standalone called Viper, which is situated in the Soviet-Afghan War. He publishes that in 2009. And of course gives many, many interviews throughout, really down to the present. I should mention that the Witcher saga spun off a vast amount of other media, including comic books that began getting published in the 1990s. In 1993 to 1995, there was also a Dark Horse series, which was not based on Sapkowski stories, apparently, but others. Polish TV created a Witcher series back in 2001, which also led to a movie. There's, of course, the Netflix series, which is still going on right now. And there's a little bit of controversy about that. Sapkowski himself says, well, I just advise, I don't tell people what to do. There was a role-playing video game put out by CD Projekt Red and other Witcher-based games. And Sapkowski himself has sued at least one of the game things for a contract in which he thought he got the short end of the deal. I should mention as well that The Witcher has resulted in some musical things as well. 2009, the Russian heavy metal band Essa brought out a rock opera based on The Witcher. And in 2017, the musical theater of Gdynia brought out a musical based on it as well. So there's a number of different reinterpretations that people are making of these very, very interesting, dark, reflective, captivating works that Sapkowski has brought into being. It doesn't appear that he has any plans to add to the Witcher universe with new stories or novels, but he is still, for an author, relatively young, in his 70s, so who knows what we'll see on the horizon. As it stands, he produced 8 great books of the Witcher series, and as I mentioned, many other great books as well. We're focusing primarily on the Witcher stuff, so that's where the center of attention lies. That's probably enough about his bio for the present. So Sapkowski has been interviewed many times, not just because of his Witcher books, but also because of the television shows, the games. You know, he goes to various conventions, talks with people, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about his own world, the characters, the processes, some of the points that he wants to make. You can also tell when you read the interviews that he's not a jaded person, but he's not an optimist, and he is very willing to be blunt about things, which I quite like. And he's also influenced by some other authors, you could say, who adopt, similar perspectives. So in the Wired interview, he's asked, what is the secret that makes Geralt of Rivia such a fan-favorite character? So he says, when I created him in the first story to submit him to a fantasy fiction competition in Poland, I had only one choice before me: do it well or not do it at all. For me, the story of a book is like the marquee of a circus. The protagonist is the pole that supports it, and the secondary characters are the pegs that keep it anchored to the ground. All of this must be built in the best possible way so as not to collapse under its own weight. And then I wonder what moves the protagonist, and the answer is obvious: a woman. And we're going to talk more about women in a bit. That's a very interesting metaphor, isn't it? A circus, a tent pole, pegs, a marquee that is bringing things off. So he says, speaking of women, in your books, the female characters are almost always stronger and more determined than the male ones. And he says, yeah, sure, because that's how it is in real life. Women are and always have been stronger than men. Now, isn't that an interesting thing to say? And, if you look into your own memories, you can probably find many strong women, many resourceful women. And then he's asked, would you define yourself as a feminist? And he says, no, I adore women. I adore their role in a story and in the world, but I don't make a philosophy out of it. And, we could say similar things about his attitudes towards races and exploitation, domination, colonization, genocide. He doesn't make a philosophy out of it. There are a few places where characters in the books will have reflections about, how terrible this particular thing is and why can't we get along. But Sapkowski isn't going to tip his hand and say, yes, I'm telling a story that has these definite themes. Now, here's another interesting follow-up in that same interview. The Geralt of the books always tries to stay out of politics, only to fail miserably. Does he think that fantasy plays a similar role, that it wants to be, as many argue, a form of escapism to forget the problems of the real world? And Sapkowski says, many try to frame fantasy, to define it as escapism, but it's not like that. With The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien certainly wasn't trying to escape from the real world. Those who seek escapism are welcome, but that's not the aim of a fantasy author. And maybe we need to modify this and say, well, it's not the theme of a great fantasy author, but it could be the theme of, second-rate fantasy authors. Sapkowski was able to see the sort of blossoming and burgeoning of the fantasy landscape in book sales and what was available in books in the 70s and in the 80s as he traveled. We have another interview here with Christian Handel, who says, as the author of the Witcher saga, what is it you like most about Geralt? And Sapkowski says, he's a fictional character created to serve the story, which revolves around him. Again, we see the sort of, tent pole, right? If the fictional character serves the story well, an author likes his character. If an author doesn't like his character, finds him unlikable or faulty in any part or aspect, it means an author has done his job poorly, or he's schizophrenic, or both. So that's a very telling observation. The characters belong to the author. The author is responsible for the characters being compelling characters. He goes on as well, and he's asked, there's a lot of novels which people love but are forgotten over time. Some maintain their significance over time. Why do you think the Witcher saga has remained so popular? And so Sapkowski says, well, and he uses this in many interviews, very true is the proverb, habent sua fata libelli, or books have their own destinies. The rest is silence. So he's not going to prognosticate about, why the books are successful. And then he's asked again, which part of your fantasy world do you like most and why? And he says, my fantasy world was created to serve the story. Look above the answer to question 1. Character, world, are serving story and the work of storytelling. Now, here's where we get to the world building. How much did you know about that world and its characters when you first started to write about them, and how long did it take you to create such an epic setting? Sapkowski, nothing at all. Don't forget I began with short stories. You don't create universes in short stories. There is literally and metaphorically no place for them. Later, when my stories started evolving into full novels, the necessity of some coherent background became imminent, and slowly, step by step, something resembling a universe began to emerge. But it's only in the background, so it plays a secondary role in the story. Now, shifting, he's asked, your short stories seem to draw heavily from folklore and fairy tales. Why did you decide to play with these motifs in your writing? And so Sapkowski then says, well, one of the subgenres of the fantasy genre, there are several of them, is called the retelling, which consists of taking classic fairy tales, fables, legends, or myths and telling them anew, whether changed, modified, sometimes even distorted or twisted in perverse ways. I just used the classic technique. And then he's asked, it shifts again back to short stories. The Witcher saga started with short stories. In your opinion, what are the advantages of short stories? Sapkowski says, and notice who he's referencing here, Isaac Asimov used to say a short story is a straight line, a novel is a plane. In the story, the writer and the reader go straight from point A to point B. In the novel, you move in many directions. Both have their advantages and disadvantages, depending on what an author or reader likes or dislikes. And then he's asked again, well, why did you expand the Witcher saga into a series of full-length novels? And he says, once again, notice he's got this tendency. If I've already said something, why do I have to repeat myself? Isaac Asimov, straight line and plane. For me, it was a natural consequence. At some point, I felt tied up and limited by the size of a short story or novella and desired to abandon the line and ride the wide plane. I will say, though, so, Blood of Elves, Time of Contempt, rather. So these two, The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, short stories, right? And they're episodic. You could look at these novels as also being bundles of short stories that all actually fit together, depending on which point of view we're looking at. So, that's kind of interesting. And then here's the last thing from that interview. If you could invite 2 fictional or historical characters for a dinner party, who would you choose and why? So notice who he says. He doesn't say Tolkien. He says Ernest Hemingway and Umberto Eco. I consider them the best writers of all time. Now, this is very interesting. Hemingway, not known for fantasy, known for a kind of realism, a pared-down realism, and a simplistic way of writing, deceptively simplistic. And then Umberto Eco, who's quite florid, brings all sorts of theory in. As a matter of fact, when you read Eco's novels and you also read Eco's, theory books, you see him plagiarizing himself constantly in the novels, which, maybe that's a good way of writing. There's also a great fantasy mundo, fantasy world interview. And here we get to a different topic. They ask him, in your stories, you take the part of the losers and the defenseless. Does this owe to a certain social justice? From this, it's not common to encounter in fantasy so demoralizing and terrible in its message as yours. Were you conscious of this? Are you a natural demythizer when you wrote the books of Geralt of Rivia? Can one assume an analogy with, different author, Raymond Chandler? And then Sapkowski says, yep, you have nailed it. Geralt has much in common with Philip Marlowe. He is a cynic. No one will deny that all writers, we are doubters of our previous readings, nor that we are intelligent and we have a blank check to do what we want. We make ourselves more intelligent when we speak than the rest, when we want a woman or we hate another person. I am the result of my readings of Alexander Dumas, Henryk Sienkiewicz, Raymond Chandler, Roger Zelazny, Jack Vance, Jules Verne, Arturo Perez Reverte. They have created me as a writer. Again, notice who's not in there. Ernest Hemingway, Umberto Eco. These are the people who, he says, spurred him, influenced him, shaped him the most. And he says, this is now what's passing with me. There are many that use me as a writer and who I influenced. There are things that are implanted in the brain of someone when they write. I am now in others, and it is normal, the same as Chandler is in me. I do not believe Chandler would be offended by this, since I'm only transferring the book the same cynicism he used, but in place of the dark streets of San Francisco to the malodorous streets of some place which has never existed and never will exist, it is absolutely the same, and people like it, of course. Don't forget that when I began 13 years ago, all the world in Poland was absolutely sick of superhero stories, and they wanted a story of a person who was not omnipotent. I received many letters and emails questioning why Geralt is so weak, but I know that they want it too. And Fantasy Mundo goes on, do you believe that time could convert the world of Geralt de Rivia into one of the great sagas of fantasy literature? So, is this going to be like The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, the Middle Earth? Is this going to be like Earthsea? Is this going to be like, to take Roger Zelazny, Amber, Chaos, and all the other things in between? So Sapkowski says, to respond to that, to say that the saga is going to end up being one of the great ones of fantasy would be immodest on my part. Of course, I've done what I have been able to do. In Poland, I placed the first stone, certainly, and now there are more authors that are learning to do the same. Perhaps after my death, which could be near, some critics will place me on that list of the best of fantasy like David Pringle did in his 100 Best Books of Fantasy, where all of them are Anglo-Saxons except for Patrick Suskind and his Perfume and Michael Ende and The Never-Ending Story. Many critics have said to my face, we don't like Eskimos writing about zebras, and now they are the zebras. Time will tell. Then there's a shift in perspective, and this goes to some of the key characters and their relationships. Seeing the triangle which Geralt, Yennefer, and Ciri form, I couldn't avoid seeing in them the sketch of the traditional Western family. Had you already a preconception of a pseudo-familial development for these characters, or did the idea emerge little by little? And I think there's a lot of other people who see that as well. Ciri is this younger child, and Geralt has, they're involved because of destiny, and Geralt is also involved with Yennefer, and Ciri, is got an attachment to Yennefer. Triss also plays an important role until she, of course, passes away at this great battle in Sodden. But there's other things going on as well. Are they really a nuclear family? So Sapkowski says, the first thing I did was fight against the stereotype, to present the typical hero who seeks a reward, who saves the World Trade Center, Tel Aviv, who has all the women he wants. I've altered the myth. This is a hero which says, don't screw with me, don't bother me anymore. To place this hero in front of different situations, such as a woman who also departs from the stereotypes, could be very harsh, but also very interesting. Cherchez la femme. Look to the woman, right? And they go on as well. Fantasy Mundo says, are these characters based on any real-life models? And he says, not a single one of them is based on real people. I'm very strict with this, and I want you to believe they all came from my imagination. I've never intended to make a caricature of someone, nor to laugh at someone, nor to demonstrate I dislike someone. My readers don't give a shit who I hate. I cannot hate anyone when I write, though. Of truth, yes, I dislike people, but would never be so arrogant as to show this to my readers. These are not allegories, in another way of speaking, right? Then they asked, judging by the apocalyptic tone which presides over your books, I have the impression that you are, in truth, about a clash of civilizations. And Sapkowski says, that's right. My case is not so extreme as that of Tolkien. He suffered a hecatomb from his youth, and he spoke of pollution and poisoned rivers. What do we mean, a hecatomb? A massive sacrifice. Tolkien was in World War I, one of the bloodiest wars, in the recent history. And so he says, I am now 60 years old. Many of the living things which I've known have disappeared. Animals, plants, insects, crustaceans. From what was there when I was 10 years old, already not remaining. It is a disaster, and all that's occurred in the scope of one man's lifetime. He's talking about the Anthropocene and the, perhaps great destruction of diversity and, animal and plant and other life within our world that we're running through. So he says, what can happen here in 50 years? Perhaps it will all disappear and the world will be reduced to ashes. Thinking of it terrifies me. In another interview with Lit Hub, he's asked about world building again, and this time it's about mythologies and creatures. He says, what kind of mythology did you draw on to create the world of The Witcher? And Sapkowski says, well, it would be easier to name the mythologies and cultures I didn't draw on, because there were, just to mention a few, Slavic mythology, vampires, leshies, kikmoras, vodaños. There was the Germanic wild hunt, the Portuguese bruxa, the Arabic ghoul, the Scottish kilmulies. There were dryads from Greek myths, Paracelsian gnomes, the Japanese kitsune or foxwoman. There was the Little Mermaid, that is Hans Christian Andersen. There was Snow White by the Brothers Grimm. There was Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont's Beauty and the Beast. Elves and dwarves are, let's say, Tolkien-esque. You could say it's quite an eclectic cocktail, but that was the modus operandi I adopted. So he's, bringing together very, very deliberately all sorts of things into this fantasy world. He's also asked something very interesting about the writing process. How do you tackle writer's block? And I love this answer. Writer's block is overrated. The term was invented and established by lazy writers who didn't feel like writing and needed to find an excuse with agents and publishers. The truth is there's always some work to be done with a book, even if you don't feel like writing. You can correct what you've already written. Corrections never do any harm. You can do research, study source materials. You can read the competitors' books, not to steal their ideas, but to be familiar with current trends and to find the right course to steer among them. So very interesting reflections there on the craft of writing, which for Sapkowski, this is very unvarnished stuff. There's no yes, I am the great writer up in the sky coming down to you with ideas. This is a job. Elsewhere, he's actually talked about the difference between craftsmen and really good writers, and he says, the kind of stuff that I do, I'm an artist, So he's brutally honest about his own talents, but he doesn't project vanity in any respect. The last interview that I want to bring up is from IO9, and he says, when you were first approached about doing a show adaptation of the Witcher books, how did you feel about it? Did you have any reservations? Sapkowski says, well, I must confess I was reluctant at first. I've been approached before by many people, mostly far from being serious. So I practically lost hope and was difficult to persuade when suddenly another offer appeared. But the specific offer was businesslike and the people behind it sympathetic. I had every reason to react positively. And then he's asked, was there anything you insisted be included or fought for in the show, the Witcher series with Netflix, he means? Sapkowski says, for the record, I strongly believe in the freedom of an artist in his artistic expression. I do not interfere with and do not impose my views on other artists. I do not insist on anything, and I do not fight for anything. I advise when necessary and asked for. So he's content to let other people work with the series that he's developed. And if you actually do watch the Witcher series, you will recognize many of the stories from these interwoven in there. And then there's important changes as well. There's places, just as with the adaptation of the Lord of the Rings to the movies, you can be like, well, this didn't happen this way, right? And you can say a similar thing about that. We could say much more about George R.R. Martin's the Game of Thrones TV show, which was progressively worse the more it deviated from the books. Sapkowski is saying, I'm going to let artists be artists. And there's a certain kind of artistry in adapting something to a different setting. I'm not a TV producer. I'm not a, for that matter, video game developer. So what they do with the source material that I provide them with, I can have opinions about it. I can advise them, but I'm not going to dictate to them the way it has to go, because that's their business as artists, as we could say interpreters. And I actually find that quite refreshing. So I think these are some useful interviews that give you a better idea of what's going on with these characters, how Sapkowski is developing them, what's going through his mind, and his general approach to fantasy literature and to his sources, acknowledging the other writers that have contributed to who he is and what this series looks like. We've reached the point in our session where we're going to be spending a lot of time digging around in the books. And I think that since Sapkowski has framed Geralt as the main character around which the stories, understandably, the Witcher stories, are oriented as the pole that is holding the circus tent up and the other characters as tent pegs, maybe we should begin with him. I should say, however, that as we move from the short stories into the novels, we see that point of view will change, and Ciri will be, a point of view character quite a bit. Tris Marigold will already in Blood of Elves, and there's also Yennefer and Dandelion, and they're not minor characters by any stretch. As a matter of fact, by the end of A Time of Contempt, I think you can say that not only has Yennefer become massively important as a character, and we're getting to see more and more of her points of view, but Ciri is really becoming incredibly important. As a matter of fact, this novel ends essentially with a lot of action and character development and decisions on her part. But we'll come back to that in a bit. So the stories begin with this character, the Witcher, in the very first, one that we have here in the first book, the voice of reason, and then they continue on. And one of the things that we see about Geralt is that there is, he does have a fixed-shaped character, but there's some development that's going on, particularly in response not just to falling in love with Yennefer, or, hanging out with Dandelion, who becomes his friend, or caring about Ciri, but getting brought into the larger picture of the conflicts that are developing. He wants to pose himself as essentially just doing his job, not getting involved with other things. He's kind of, not just kind of, very cynical about stuff, but we're going to see that change. And I've selected a number of passages where we get to see him in conversation with other people, expressing what his point of view is. We could have selected many others, but let's just go through these and see what they reveal about this guy. So this is early on. Dandelion is having a discussion with Geralt, and he says, the world is changing, the sun sets, vodka is coming to an end. What else, in your opinion, is coming to an end? You mentioned something about endings, philosopher. And then Geralt says, well, I'll give you a couple of examples, all from 2 months of this side of the Buena. One day I ride up and what do I see? A bridge, and under that bridge sits a troll and demands every passerby pay him. Those who refuse have a leg injured, sometimes both. So I go to the alderman, how much are you going to give me for that troll? And he says, he's amazed. What are you talking about? Who will repair the bridge if the troll's not there? He repairs it regularly with the sweat of his brow. Solid work, first rate. It's cheaper to pay his toll. So I ride on. What do I see? A forked tail, not very big, about 4 yards. Nose tip to tail tip, it's flying, carrying a sheep in its talons. I go to the village. How much will you pay me for the forked tail? No, the peasants shout. It's our baron's youngest daughter's favorite dragon. If a scale falls from its back, the baron will burn our hamlet and skin us. I ride on, and I'm getting hungrier and hungrier. Ask around for a work. Certainly it's there, but what work? To catch a ruscala for one man, a nymph for another, a dryad for a third. They've gone completely mad. The villages are teeming with girls, but they want humanoids. Another asked me to kill a Mecopterian and bring him a bone from its hand because crushed and poured into a soup, it cures impotence. And Dandelion says, if people are inclined to pay, and Geralt says, I'm not going to kill Mecopterans, nor any other harmless creatures. And then Dandelion says, well, you'll go hungry then unless you change your line of work. Become a priest. You wouldn't be bad at it with all your scruples, your morality, your knowledge of people and everything. The fact you don't believe in any gods shouldn't be a problem. I don't know many priests who do. Become a priest and stop feeling sorry for yourself, right? And he says, Geralt, you remind me of an old fisherman who, towards the end of his life, discovers that fish stink and the breeze from the sea makes your bones ache. Be consistent. Talking and regretting won't get you anywhere. If I were to find the demand for poetry had come to an end, I'd hang up my lute and become a gardener. I'd grow roses. Right? And then they go on and they talk about the world that is coming. He says, you witchers deprive yourself of work, slowly but surely. The better and more conscientiously you work, the less work there is for you. After all, your goal is a world without monsters, a world which is peaceful and safe, a world where witchers are unnecessary. A paradox, isn't it? So there's, that's an important thing to note. There's a paradoxicality to the very calling, actually not just calling, but imposition upon Geralt of being a witcher. A little bit further on, he's riding with Dandelion as well, and they're talking about non-existent monsters at first, people believing in them, and then Dandelion says, Geralt, monsters do exist. Maybe not as many as before, maybe they don't lurk behind every tree in the forest, but they're there. They exist. So how do you account for people inventing ones then? What's more, believing in what they invent? What's the deal with that? Haven't you wondered why? And he says, well, I have, and I do know why. People, Geralt says, like to invent monsters and monstrosities. Then they seem less monstrous themselves. When they get blind, drunk, cheat, steal, beat their wives, starve an old woman, when they kill a trapped fox with an axe or riddle the last existing unicorn with arrows, they like to think that the bane entering cottages at daybreak is more monstrous than they are. They feel better then. They find it easier to live. So, what we see here is Geralt, he knows from, long experience how bad people can be. He also he's not so jaded that he doesn't sometimes welcome moments of goodness or, charity. camaraderie, but he's just very realistic about how human beings are, and his profession gives him some additional insights that other people often lack. In the Sword of Destiny, we find discussion about order and chaos that is involved. And, we should remember, too, that magic involves chaos. So there's this discussion that's going on here. And here we go. The Witcher shrugged, prices are going up. One has to live, as a sorceress acquaintance of mine used to say. Quite a selective approach, very practical, I'd say. But the root of it lies some idea, Geralt, the conflict between the forces of order and the forces of chaos. As a sorcerer acquaintance of mine used to say, I imagine that you carry out your mission defending people from evil, always and everywhere without distinction. You stand on a clearly defined side of the palisade, right, of the wall. And then Geralt says, the forces of order, the forces of chaos, awfully high-flown words, Borges. You desperately want to position me on one side of the palisade in a conflict which is generally thought to be perennial, begun long before us, and will endure long after we've gone. On which side, now notice what he's asking here, on which side does the farrier shoeing horses stand, or our innkeeper hurrying here with a cauldron of lamb? What, in your opinion, defines the border between order and chaos? A very simple thing, said Three Jackdaws, and looked at him straight in the eye. That which represents chaos is menace, is the aggressive side, while order is the side being threatened and in need of protection, in need of a defender. So, they continue on, and Borges says, I understand you're not keen on being placed on either side. You do your job. That is correct. But you cannot escape the conflict between chaos and order. Although it was your comparison, you're not a farrier. I've seen you work. You go down into a dungeon among some ruins and come out with a slaughtered basilisk. There is, comrade, a difference between shoeing horses and killing basilisks. You said if the payment is fair, you'll hurry to the end of the world and dispatch the monster you're asked to. And then we get a very interesting shift in the conversation. So just to sum up at this point, we've got this philosophical conversation. Where do you fit in, Geralt? You're clearly on the side of order. You're protecting all of us from chaos. And then Borges says, let's say a fierce dragon is wreaking havoc. And then Geralt says, bad example. You see right away you've mixed up chaos and order, because I do not kill dragons, and they, without doubt, represent chaos. How so? Three Jackdaws licked his fingers. Well, I never. After all, among all monsters, dragons are probably the most bestial, the cruelest and fiercest, the most revolting of reptiles. They attack people, breathe fire, and carry off, virgins. There's no shortage of tales like that. It can't be that you, a witcher, don't have a few dragons on your trophy list. And then he says, I don't hunt dragons, Geralt said dryly. I hunt forktails for sure, and draco lizards, and flying drakes, but not true dragons, the green, the black, or the red. Take note, please. And why? Well, because there are other people to handle that sort of thing. And Geralt, as we find out, he's actually speaking with a dragon at the time, a gold dragon, but that will come up later. So Geralt doesn't kill any sort of monster whatsoever. He's selective in what he's doing. Here we have another interesting passage a little bit later. There's this discussion between Geralt and Guildenstern. Geralt says, do you have a job for me? If so, tell me what. I'll think it over, but if you don't, there's no sense wasting our breath. And they're talking about the dragons as well. And Guildenstern says, Dorage surpasses even witchers with his whims. He does not stop at categorizing monsters into good and bad. He considers them all good. He defends his views with astonishing obstinacy. I truly would not be surprised if something befell him, and the fact he joined us keeping such curious company And then he says, the company is strange, a witcher crawling with scruples like a fox pelt with fleas, a sorcerer spouting druidic humbug about equilibrium in nature, the silent knight Borges, 3 jackdaws, and his escort from Zerikania, where, as generally is known, sacrifices are made before the image of a dragon. And suddenly they all join in the hunt, right? So they have they finish that conversation, and then Jorge comes over and says, it's quite interesting. The two of you have similar occupations, except that Ek is this sort of like noble knight, is an idealist and you're a professional. A minor difference, particularly for the ones you kill. Then Geralt says, don't compare me to Ek. The devil knows who you wrong in that comparison, him or me, but don't compare us. And then the sorcerer says, to me, Witcher, calling killing a vocation is loathsome, low, and nonsensical. Our world is in equilibrium. The annihilation, the killing of any creatures that inhabit this world upsets that equilibrium. And a lack of equilibrium brings closer extinction. Extinction and the end of the world as we know it. And then Geralt says, yes, that's a druidic theory, I know it. An old Hierophant expounded it to me once back in Rivia. 2 days after our conversation, he was torn apart by were-rats. It was impossible to prove any upset in equilibrium. The world, I repeat, Jorge glanced at him indifferently, is in equilibrium, natural equilibrium. Every species has its own natural enemies. Everyone is the natural enemy of other species. That also includes humans. The extermination of the natural enemies of humans, which you dedicate yourself to, and which one can begin to observe, threatens the degeneration of the race. And then Geralt says, do you know what, sorcerer? One day take yourself to a mother whose child has been devoured by a basilisk. Tell her she ought to be glad because thanks to that, the human race has escaped degeneration. See what she says to you. And then Yennefer rides up and the conversation ends. So what we have here, very interestingly, now it's not just order and chaos. Now it's like an environmental equilibrium and keeping the human race healthy. And Geralt is being accused by his very work of making things worse, making things too easy for the human beings and exterminating other species, which he rejects in favor of saying, you need to think about how it is for the people who are actually affected by these monsters. We notice something else very interesting in this book, this conversation between Geralt and a Doppler. Now, a Doppler is a type of non-human humanoid that can take on other people's, not just their appearances, but even their thoughts, their ways of doing things. And the Doppler is talking about what's going on, and what's been going on for a long time. Another big philosophical theme that we'll get to, exploitation, domination, genocide. So he says, I'm going to go on my way, Witcher, squeeze my way into the crowd and change quietly into any old person, even a beggar, because I prefer being a beggar in Novigrad to being a Doppler in the woods. Novigrad owes me something, Geralt. The building of a city here tainted a land we could have lived in our natural form. We have been exterminated, hunted down like rabid dogs. I'm one of the few to survive. I want to survive, and I will survive. Long ago, when wolves pursued me in the winter, I turned into a wolf and ran with the pack for several weeks, and I survived. Now I'll do that again because I don't want to roam about through wildernesses and be forced to winter beneath fallen trees. I don't want to be forever hungry. I don't want to serve as target practice all the time. Here in Novigrad, it's warm, there's grub. I can make money, and very seldom do people shoot arrows at each other. Novigrad is a pack of wolves. I'll join that pack and survive. Understand? Geralt nodded reluctantly. You gave dwarves, halflings, gnomes, and even elves, the Doppler continued, the modest possibility of assimilation. Why should I be any worse off? Why am I denied that right? What do I have to do to be able to live in this city? Turn into a she-elf with doe eyes, silky hair, and long legs? Well, in what way is a she-elf better than me? Only at the sight of the she-elf you pick up speed, and at the sight of me you want to puke. You know where you can stuff an argument like that. I'll survive anyway. The Witcher said nothing. Yes, I said, Teleko continued calmly, I'm going. And you, this is the part that we want to pay particularly close attention to, you, Geralt, will not even try to stop me. Because I, Geralt, knew your thoughts for a moment, including the ones you don't want to admit to, the ones you even hide from yourself. Because to stop me, you'd have to kill me, and the thought of killing me in cold blood fills you with disgust, doesn't it? The Witcher said nothing. Farewell, Geralt, he said. Thank you. Farewell, Dudu, the Witcher replied. Good luck. So he doesn't just concede it to him. He actually says, good luck. Geralt is, as he's a person with scruples, as he's been talked about before. He thinks about these matters, even though he is a, definitely man of action. One last discussion from this book that I think is kind of interesting. Dandelion is saying this to Geralt. And actually, we learn a lot about Geralt by reflection through what other characters have to say about him, whether it's correct or incorrect. Dandelion knows Geralt pretty well. They're close friends, and he composes songs about him, so he has to do a good bit of thinking about that. Dandelion says, do you know what your problem is, Geralt? You think you're different. You flaunt your otherness, what you consider abnormal. You aggressively impose that abnormality on others, not understanding that for people who think clear-headedly, you're the most normal man under the sun. And they all wish that everybody was so normal. What of it that you have quicker reflexes than most and vertical pupils in sunlight? That you can see in the dark like a cat, that you know a few spells. Big deal. I, my dear, once knew an innkeeper who could fart for 10 minutes without stopping, playing the tune to the psalm, Greet us, O morning star. Heedless of his, let's face it, unusual talent, the innkeeper was the most normal among the normal. He had a wife, children, and a grandmother afflicted by palsy. What does it have to do with Essie Davin? Could you explain, Geralt says. Of course, you wrongfully thought, Geralt, that Little Eye was interested in you out of morbid, downright, perverted curiosity, that she looks at you as if you were a queer fish, a two-headed calf, or a salamander in a menagerie. And you immediately became annoyed, gave her a rude, undeserved reprimand at the first opportunity, struck back a blow she hadn't dealt. I witnessed it, after all. I didn't witness the further course of events, but when I noticed your flight from the room and saw her glowing cheeks when you returned. Yes, Geralt, I'm alerting you to a mistake, and you've already made it. You wanted to take revenge on her for, in your opinion, her morbid curiosity. You tried to learn whether it was possible to bet her in the hay if she was curious to find out what it's like to make love with a misfit, a witcher. Fortunately, Essie turned out to be smarter than you, and generously took pity on your stupidity, having understood its cause. Right? And then he goes on and he says, do you really not prefer normal girls like Essie? What do sorceresses have that Essie doesn't? Age, perhaps? Little Eye may not be the youngest, but she's as old as she looks. And you know what Yennefer once confessed to me after a few stiff drinks? She told me the first time she did it with a man, it was exactly a year after the invention of the two-furrow plow, right? So he was very, very old. And what does this conversation reveal to us? Well, the Witcher, Geralt, he's a misfit. He's a mutant. He's been modified from the normal human condition. He feels alienated. He doesn't fit in. He goes from place to place where people in general know where they fit in the social order, and he comes in as an intruder, and he projects outward the idea that everyone is looking at him as if he's the weirdo, the person who doesn't really belong. And in some cases, like Dandelion says, he really is just a normal person who happens to have uncanny abilities. In The Blood of Elves, the first novel, we see Geralt talking with Triss and Vesemir, and they're discussing what they're going to do in terms of the council and war and all that. So Triss says, War is constantly hovering over us like a vulture. For you, it's an adventure. For me, it's a game in which the stakes are survival. I'm involved in this game. That's why your indifference and frivolity hurt and insult me. And Geralt says, we're witchers, Triss. Can't you understand that? What's there to understand? Everything's crystal clear, she says. You've chosen a certain attitude to the world around you. The fact that this world might at any moment fall to pieces has a place in this choice. In mine, it doesn't. That's where we differ. Geralt says, I'm not sure that's only there where we differ. The world is falling in ruins, she repeated. We can watch it happen and do nothing, or we can counteract it. Then Cohen says, the world is falling to ruins. How many times have I heard that? Me too, Lambert grimaced, and it's not surprising. It's a popular saying of late. It's what kings say when it turns out that a modicum of brains is necessary to rule after all. It's what merchants say when greed and stupidity have led them to bankruptcy. It's what wizards say when they start to lose their influence on politics or income. And the person they're speaking to should expect some sort of proposal straight away. So cut the introduction short, Triss, and present us with your proposition. So it's not just Geralt, it's the other Witchers who have this view of, well, things are always messed up. People are always complaining that we're in crisis. We should just focus on our jobs, killing monsters. So Triss says, you know what I mean. You want to hide your heads in the sand. That's your business. But coming from you, Geralt, it's a great surprise. Triss, Geralt says, what do you expect from me? To take an active part in the fight to save a world which is falling to pieces? Am I to enlist in the army and stop Nilfgaard? Should I, if it comes to another battle for Sodden, stand with you on the hill, shoulder to shoulder, and fight for freedom? I'd be proud, she said quietly, lowering her head. I'd be proud and happy to fight at your side. And here Geralt is going to tell us something very important about himself. I believe that, but I'm not gallant enough, not valiant enough. I'm not suited to be a soldier or a hero, and having an acute fear of pain, mutilation, and death is not the only reason. You can't stop a soldier from being frightened, but you can give him motivation to help him overcome that fear. I have no such motivation. I kill monsters for money. I defend children when their parents pay me to. I'm a witcher, an artificially created mutant. If Nilfgaardian parents pay me, I'll defend Nilfgaardian children. And even if the world lies in ruin, which does not seem likely to me, I'll carry on killing monsters in the ruins of this world until some monster kills me. That is my fate, my reason, my life, and my attitude to the world. It's not what I chose. It was chosen for me. She goes on and she responds and she says, you're embittered or pretending to be. You forget that I know you, so don't play the unfeeling mutant, devoid of a heart, of scruples, and of his own free will in front of me. And the reasons for your bitterness I can guess and understand. Ciri's prophecy. Correct? Ciri, the child, the person that Geralt gets to claim, or who claims him by the law of surprise, from the Cintra kingdom, and her grandmother, the lioness of Cintra, reorients the life of Geralt, imposes a destiny upon him. So. He says, no, not correct. I see that you don't know me at all. I am afraid of death, just like everyone else, but I grew used to the idea of it very long ago. I'm not under any illusions. I'm not complaining about fate. Triss, this is plain cold calculation, statistics. No Witcher has yet died of old age, lying in bed dictating his will. Not a single one. Ciri didn't surprise or frighten me. I know I'm going to die in some cave which stinks of carcasses, torn apart by a griffin, lamia, or manticore. But I don't want to die in a war because they're not my wars. And then she says, I'm surprised at this. I'm surprised you're saying this, surprised by your lack of motivation, as you learnedly chose to describe your supercilious distance and indifference. You were at Sodden, Angren and Transriver. You know what happened to Sintra. You know what befell Queen Calanth and many thousands of people there. You know the hell Ciri went through, why she cries out at night. And I know too, because I was also there. I am afraid of pain and death too, even more now than I was then. I have good reason. As for motivation, it seems to me back then that I had just as little as you. Why should I, a magician, care about the fates of Sodden, Brugge, Sintra, or other kingdoms, the problems of having more or less competent rulers, the interests of merchants and barons? I was a magician. I, too, could have said it wasn't my war, that I could mix elixirs for the Nilfgaardians on the ruins of the world, but I stood on that hill next to Vilgefortz, next to Artaud Terra Nova, next to Faircart, next to Enid Finnebar and Philippa Eilhart, next to your Yennefer, next to those who no longer exist, Coral, Yoel, Vaniel. There was a moment when, out of sheer terror, I forgot all my spells except for one, and thanks to that spell, I could have teleported myself from that horrible place back to my home. There was a moment when I threw up from fear, when Yennefer and Coral held me up on my shoulders and hair, and then Geralt says, "Stop, please stop." And she says, "No, I won't." And she goes on and narrates it, he holds her closer, and then she says, "They used the highest magics on us, spells, elixirs, amulets, and artifacts. Nothing was left wanting for the wounded heroes of the hill. We were cured, patched up, our former appearances returned to us, our hair and sight restored. You can hardly see the marks, but I will never wear a plunging neckline again, Geralt. Never." The Witchers said nothing, right? So then she says, "So don't talk to me about motivation." We have a lot of interesting discussion here. And then Ciri pipes up and says, "I'll stand next to you," right? So there's this big moment of conflict. Where are people's loyalties? Where will their commitments actually lie? And I think it's important that the most fruitful discussions in this take place not just between sparring, with this misguided person over here or this one over here, but between Geralt and the people who he has love or friendship with, certainly respect. That gets him thinking about where he's going to eventually commit himself, which he will do. I'm actually going to skip over the discussion with the master tutor because I don't want to spend too much time, and jump into the final book, The Time of Contempt. Contempt. I keep on screwing up that word. And I do want to bring up this other discussion that takes place. So Vilgefortz asked Geralt. Vilgefortz is this great sorcerer, and Geralt is narrating this to Yennefer. "Why didn't you become a sorcerer, Geralt? Weren't you ever attracted by the art? Be honest." "I will. I was." "Well, then why didn't you follow the voice of that attraction?" "I decided it would be wiser to follow the voice of good sense." "Meaning?" "Years of practice in the Witcher's trade have taught me not to bite off more than I can chew. Do you know, Vilgefortz, I once knew a dwarf who as a child dreamed of being an elf. What do you think? Would he have become one if he followed the voice of attraction?" Vilgefortz says, "Is that supposed to be a comparison, a parallel? If so, it's utterly ill-judged. A dwarf could not become an elf, not without having an elf for its mother." Geralt remained silent for a long time. "I get it," he finally said. "I should have guessed. You've been having a root around in my life history. To what purpose, if you don't mind?" "Perhaps," said the sorcerer faintly, "I'm dreaming of a painting in the Gallery of Glory, the two of us seated at a table, and on a brass plaque the title, Vilgefortz of Roggeveen entering into a pact with Geralt of Rivia." That would be an allegory, so the Witcher, with the title, Knowledge Triumphing Over Ignorance. I'd prefer a more realistic painting entitled, In Which Vilgefortz Explains to Geralt What This Is All About. And Vilgefortz says, "Isn't it obvious? Have you forgotten the painting I'm dreaming of hangs in the Gallery of Glory, where future generations, who know perfectly well what's about, what event is depicted in the picture, can look at it. On the canvas, Vilgefortz and Geralt are negotiating and concluding an agreement, as a result of which Geralt, following the voice, not some kind of attraction or predilection, but a genuine vocation, finally joined the ranks of mages. This brings to an end his erstwhile and not particularly sensible existence, which has no future whatsoever. Just think, said the Witcher, after a lengthy silence, that not so long ago I believed nothing more could astonish me. Believe me, Vilgefortz, I'll remember this banquet and this pageant of incredible events for a long time. Worthy of a painting indeed. The title would be Geralt leaving the Isle of Thanedd shaking with laughter. And he goes on and says, the causes of our misunderstanding are clear to me. We differ too much to understand each other. You are a mighty sorcerer from the chapter who has achieved oneness with nature. I'm a wanderer, a witcher, a mutant who travels the world and slays monsters for money. We differ too greatly, and the minor fact that my mother was by accident was a sorceress is unable to erase that difference. So we actually do find out in the story is that his mother was a sorceress. She, in fact, at one point heals him in one of the narratives that's going on, and then departs as well. She gave him to the Witchers, and the Witchers did horrible things to him to make him into the kind of person that he is, because that's what is required in order to produce the sort of person who can fight monsters and survive. Most of the young boys who are given to the Witchers don't actually make it through the process. And interestingly, I'll close on this. In the first novel, The Blood of Elves, we do see Ciri being brought up. She's not going to be given the herbs and elixirs and stuff like that, but she is being brought up among the Witchers and effectively being trained for their way of life. But Ciri is another story to which we need to turn now as another philosophical theme. I think this is enough of an exploration of Geralt as arguably the most central character, as Sapkowski called him, the great pole on which the entire tent of the story is supported. If we find the metaphor compelling that Sapkowski has used to talk about his storytelling with a circus tent with one main pole that is Geralt as the main character holding everything up, and then other characters as being the tent pegs, we actually need to modify it as the stories go on. In the first two books, we can say, yes, that's correct. Geralt is the main character, but we're going to have some other very important ones introduced as the stories go on, namely his good friend Dandelion, and of course the love of his life, Yennefer. And then we're also going to have this character who begins in the stories as just a promise and will become a major main character as a child going through, eventually becoming arguably an even more main character by the time we get to the time of Contempt, and that is Ciri. We also do have one other character, Triss Marigold, who will play a significant role as well. And maybe what we want to say is, yes, it starts out as a circus tent with just one pole, but then we find that the tent pegs turn into poles of their own, and the tent gets much larger, a place where we can do more, see more, witness more. And I'm just going to run sort of sequentially through all of these and not talking about Triss so much, just in interest of time. So the very first thing I want to bring up is what happens towards the end of the story that has to do with Queen Calanthe and her court and Pavetta and Duny. So Calanthe is telling Geralt to forgive, and then Duny says, ask again, what do you ask for? And Geralt says, In order to become a witcher, you have to be born in the shadow of destiny, and very few are born like that. That's why there are so few of us. We're growing old, dying without anyone to pass our knowledge, our gifts on to. We lack successors. And this world is full of evil, which waits for the day none of us are left. And so he, asks, for the object, you could say, of the law of surprise. And he's going to show up once a child has been born and claim that child. We'll come back to that in a bit. So the next passage to look at has to do with talking with Dandelion, who's now joined the Witcher on some of his adventures. And Dandelion is a bard. He is a troubadour, a singer. He takes the stories that are halfway true, turns them into song, makes them bigger than life, and spreads the story of the Witcher, as well as so many other stories, far and wide. And he's a very roguish guy, right? He's always getting in trouble with one person or another. He has love affairs which turn out badly. And as it turns out, he and Geralt are caught up by this band of elves, and we're going to talk a little bit about that dynamic a little bit later on in this. And he shows that he can have a certain kind of courage as well. Geralt tells the elves, spare Dandelion at least, not out of lofty mercy, out of common sense. And, the elves say, if he survives thanks to you, he'll undoubtedly feel obliged to avenge you. And Dandelion says, you can be sure of that. You can be sure of that, you son of a bitch. Kill me too, because I promise otherwise I'll set the world against you. You'll see what lice from a fur coat can do. We'll finish you off, even if we have to level these mountains of yours to the ground. You can be sure of that. And then Geralt says, how stupid you are, Dandelion. And he says, your mother gives birth to you only once, and only once do you die. The poet said haughtily, the effect somewhat spoiled by his teeth rattling like castanets. So he's willing to throw himself in with the Witcher completely, even though he is, in fact, afraid. There's some other interesting things coming up. Lady Yennefer will come in an adventure where Dandelion has been injured, in fact, but magically. And so Geralt brings him to Yennefer. And we get this interesting description. The woman sat up, scrambling out of the bedclothes. She had pretty shoulders, a shapely neck, and around it a black velvet choker with a star-shaped jewel sparkling with diamonds. Apart from the choker, she had nothing on, so clearly she's not into modesty. She's kind of above that. Thank you. She took the mug from his hand, drank greedily. Who are you? Asked the black-haired woman, narrowing her eyes and covering herself. What are you doing here, and where, damn it, is Barant, her servant? And he says, well, which question shall I answer first? He immediately regretted the sarcasm. The woman raised her hand and a golden streak shot out from her fingers. Geralt reacted instinctively, crossing both hands in the sign of heliotrope, and caught the spell just in front of his face. But the discharge was so strong it threw him back against the wall. No need, he shouted, seeing the woman raise her hand again. Lady Yennefer, I come in peace with no evil intentions. And then she says, well, who are you? And he says, I'm Geralt of Rivia, a witcher. And she says, how did you get in here and for what reason? And then she says, a witcher. Not only is it the first one I've seen up close, but it's none other than the famous White Wolf, right? So they're encountering each other for the first time. And he says, Yennefer, I rode nonstop all day from Rind. I waited at night for the gates to open. I gave your doorman, who didn't want to let me in, a blow to the head. I disturbed your sleep in peace discourteously and importunately, all because my friend needs help, which only you can give him. Give it to him, please, and then if you like, we can talk about mutations and aberrations. And what is it? Well, his friend has an injury to his throat, larynx, and vocal cords, an injury caused by a scarlet mist. So, they converse a little bit more, and a little bit later, what we're going to find is another engagement, right? She asks him to come by, and here's a very interesting passage. This tells us something about sorceresses and mages and people like that. Each to their own taste, but in actual fact, not many would describe sorceresses as good-looking. Indeed, all of them came from social circles where the only fate for daughters would be marriage. Who would have thought of condemning their daughter to years of tedious studies and the tortures of somatic mutations if she could be given away in marriage and advantageously allied? Who wished to have a sorceress in their family? Despite the respect enjoyed by magicians, a sorceress's family did not benefit from her in the least, because by the time the girl had completed her education, nothing tied her to her family anymore. Only brotherhood counted to the exclusion of all else, so daughters with no chance of finding a husband became sorceresses. Unlike priestesses and druidesses, who only unwillingly took in ugly or crippled girls, sorcerers took anyone who showed evidence of a predisposition. If the child passed the first years of training, magic entered into the equation. Straightening and evening out legs, repairing bones which had badly knitted, patching hair lips, removing scars, birthmarks, and pox scars. The young sorceress would become attractive because the prestige of her profession demanded it. The result was pseudo-pretty women with the angry and cold eyes of ugly girls, girls who couldn't forget their ugliness, had been covered over by the mask of magic only for the prestige of their profession. So this is, quite an interesting thing to say. And this is going to be part of the story of Yennefer. Now, towards the end of this first book, in the last of the stories, there's a wish that goes on, and Geralt has these wishes, and Yennefer has been trying to, conquer this djinn in order to get it, and she tells him, "You've still got one last wish, haven't you? Make it. You'll free the djinn, and I'll bottle it." And then, what is the wish? She tells him, "The wish, hurry up, Geralt. What do you desire? Immortality, riches, fame, power, might, privileges? Hurry! We haven't any time." "Humanity," she said suddenly, smiling nastily. "I've guessed, haven't I? That's what you want. That's what you dream of release, of the freedom to be who you want, not who you have to be. The djinn will fulfill that wish, Geralt. Just say it." He stayed silent. She stood over him in the flickering radiance of the wizard sphere and the glow of magic amidst the flashes of rays, restraining the djinn, streaming hair and eyes, blazing violet, erect, slender, dark, terrible, and beautiful. All of a sudden she leant over and looked him in the eyes. He caught the scent of lilac and gooseberries. "You're not saying anything," she hissed. "So what is it you desire, Witcher? What is your most hidden dream? What is it you don't know? Is it that you don't know or you can't decide? Look for it within yourself. Look deeply and carefully, because I swear by the Force you won't get another chance like this." Suddenly he knew the truth. He knew it. He knew what she used to be, what she remembered, what she couldn't forget, what she lived with, who she really was before she had become a sorceress. Her cold, penetrating, angry, wise eyes were that of a hunchback. He was horrified. No, not of the truth. He was horrified that she could read his thoughts, find out what he had guessed, that she would never forgive him for it. He deadened that thought within himself, killed it, threw it from his memory forever without a trace, feeling as he did so an enormous relief. Feeling that... And then suddenly the Witcher understood what it was that he wanted, and he made his wish. Now, a little bit later, she says, "That wish of yours, I heard what you wished for. I was astounded, simply astounded. I haven't expected anything but to... What made you do it, Geralt? Why? Why me? Don't you know?" She leant over him, touched him. He felt her hair smelling of lilac and gooseberries brush his face. Suddenly he knew he'd never forget that scent, that soft touch, knew he'd never be able to compare it with any other scent or touch. Yennefer kissed him, and he understood he'd never desire any lips other than hers, so soft and moist, sweet with lipstick. He knew that from that moment only she would exist, her neck, shoulders, and breasts freed from her black dress, her delicate, cool skin, which couldn't be compared to any other he had touched. He gazed into her violent eyes, the most beautiful eyes in the world, eyes which he feared would become everything. He knew Your wish, she whispered. I don't know whether such a wish can be ever fulfilled. I don't know whether there's such a force in nature that could fulfill such a wish. But if there is, then you've condemned yourself to me. So they now are connected together. Geralt actually will sleep with some other people, including Triss. But, Yennefer is, in a certain sense, his destiny, and he hers. We have, another nice connection between them, talked about here in Sword of Destiny. Very interesting scene that's developed here. And she tells him about a winter queen and about the Witcher, the wild hunt and stuff like that. And she says, there's no romance in you. And I like elven legends. They're so captivating. What a pity humans don't have any legends like that. Perhaps one day they will. Perhaps they'll create some. But what would human legends deal with? All around, wherever one looks, there's grayness and dullness. Even things which begin beautifully lead swiftly to boredom and dreariness, to that human ritual, that wearisome rhythm called life. Oh, Geralt, it's not easy being a sorceress, but comparing it to mundane human existence. And then he falls asleep. A little bit later on, we have another engagement between them. And she says, here we go. Geralt, yes, now you answer my question. The question I've never asked you, the one I've always feared. I won't ask it this time either, but answer it, because I greatly desire to hear your answer. It's the one word, the only word you've never told me. Utter it, Geralt, please. I cannot, Iain. Why not? You don't know. He smiled sadly. My answer would just be a word which doesn't express a feeling, doesn't express an emotion, because I'm bereft of them. A word which would be nothing but the sound you make when you strike a cold, empty skull. And she says, no, Geralt, that's not the truth. Or perhaps it is, but not the whole truth. You aren't bereft of feeling. Now I see it. Now I know you. Complete the sentence, Iain. You've decided. Don't lie. I know you. I can see it in your eyes. Give me your hand, she said. She took his hand between hers at once, and he felt a tingling and the pulsing of the blood in the veins of his forearm. She engages in creational magic, the most elevated accomplishment among sorcerers. She creates two black kestrels, and she says, I'm going to need them both. How wrong I was, Geralt. To what an error the vanity of the Ice Queen, convinced of her omnipotence, has brought me. For there are some things which there is no way of obtaining, even by magic. And there are gifts which may not be accepted if one is unable to reciprocate them with something equally precious. Otherwise, such a gift will slip through the fingers, melt like a shard of ice gripped in the hand, then only regret the sense of loss, and hurt will remain. I am a sorceress, Geralt. The power over matter which I possess is a gift, a reciprocated gift. For it I paid with everything I possessed. Nothing remained. I was mistaken, she repeated, but I shall correct my mistake. Emotions and feelings. Emotions, whims and lies, fascinations and games, feelings and their absence, gifts which may or may not be accepted, lies and truth. What is truth? The negation of lies or the statement of a fact? And if the fact is a lie, then what is the truth? Who is full of feelings which torment them? And who is the empty carapace of a cold skull? Who? What is truth, Geralt? What is the essence of truth? And he says, I don't know, Iain. Tell me. No, she said, and lowered her eyes. No, I cannot, Geralt. I cannot tell you that. That bird begotten from the touch of your hand will tell you. Bird, what is the essence of truth? Truth, the kestrel said, is a shard of ice. And so we have this very interesting discourse as these characters are figuring out their own relation, not just to their own pasts and their destinies, but to each other. We go on and we find that Geralt encounters Ciri here. He encounters her first in not quite realizing who she is, saves her, and she tells him My mother was a witch, so you'd better watch your step. My papa was enchanted too. It was all told to me by one of my nannies, and when Grandmama found out about it, there was a dreadful to-do, because I'm destined, you know. To do what? I don't know, Siri said intently, but I'm destined. That's what my nanny said. And Grandmama said she won't let anyone. The whole ruddy castle will collapse first. Do you understand? And Nanny has said that nothing at all can help with destiny. Ha! And then Nanny wept and Grandma yelled, do you see? I'm destined. I won't be the wife of that silly Kistrin, Geralt. He says, and so he tells her, go to sleep. And, they're with the Dryads. She doesn't want to remain with the Dryads, who would turn her into one. And then later on, we find in, Ciri talking with Geralt again. And they're slowly figuring out that they are actually going to be destined for each other. And they are in a very important way. There's an interesting confrontation between Calanthe, her grandmother, who wants to conceal her from Geralt. And Calanthe says, the Witcher is now returned after 6 years as agreed. And they talk about the storytellers and the lies that are going to be involved with this. And then she says, I've been reading up on all of this stuff. Since Pavetta's child has the chance of becoming a Witcher, I went to great pains. My sources, Geralt, reveal nothing, however, regarding how many children in 10 withstand the trial of the grasses. Would you like to satisfy my curiosity in this? And Geralt says, you know that the code and my oath forbid me from even uttering that name, much less discussing it. And then she says, well, what I've learned is 3 at most 4 in 10. Survive. First the choice, and then the trials, and then the changes. How many youngsters ultimately receive medallions and silver swords? 1 in 10? 1 in 20? And she says, I've pondered long over this, and I've come to the conclusion the selection of the children at the stage of the choice has scant significance. What difference does it make in the end, Geralt? Which child dies or goes insane, stuffed full of narcotics? What difference does it make whose brain bursts from hallucinations, whose eyes rupture and gush forth instead of becoming cat's eyes? What difference does it make whether the child destiny chose or an utterly chance one dies in its own blood and puke? Answer me. And he says, what's the point of this? Are you expecting an answer? And she says, no. I didn't expect that from you. And it turns out that he realizes that, he's being played, and then the law of surprise is, going to be central here. And she says, are all stories about the law of surprise myths? Yes, it's hard to call an accident destiny. But you witchers do not stop searching? No, we don't, but it's senseless. Nothing has any point. Do you believe a child of destiny will pass through the trials without danger? And here he says something very important. We believe such a child would not require the trials. So she goes on and says, there is no better way to pass on hereditary traits than the natural way. You went through the trials and survived. So if you need a child with special qualities and endurance, why don't you find a woman who I'm tactless, aren't I? But I think I've guessed. And as it turns out, witchers are sterile. So Ciri is going to be trained to be a witcher. And we find this in the Blood of Elves at the start. Triss Marigold, is traveling, runs into Ciri, right? And Ciri is being brought up as a sort of witcher in training. She's being bruised all the time. She's learning swordplay. She's studying things. And she's also got some clear magical abilities. And so, interestingly, what we're going to find is that Triss will say, you've got to cultivate her in different ways. She is a girl, after all, right? And she has magical abilities. So you can't just make her into a witcher. And what we're going to find is that Ciri is going to become more and more and more of a main character from the Blood of Elves onward. I'm only going to bring up, in an interest of time, a few passages from this and the following one. Yennefer and Ciri have a conversation about magic that's particularly important. And it's quite long, so I may summarize parts of this. Yennefer says magic is, in some people's opinion, the embodiment of chaos. It's a key capable of opening the forbidden door, the door behind which lurk nightmares, fear, and unimaginable horrors, behind which enemies hide and wait, destructive powers, the forces of pure evil, capable of annihilating not only the one who opens the door, but with them the entire world. And since there's no lack of those who try to open the door, someone at some point is going to make a mistake, and then the destruction of the world will be forejudged and inevitable. Magic is, therefore, the revenge and the weapon of chaos. The fact is, following the conjunction of the spheres, people have learned to use magic is the curse and undoing of the world, the undoing of mankind, and that's how it is, Ciri. Those who believe that magic is chaos are not mistaken. So that's one point of view on magic. Magic, Yennefer continued after a while, is in some people's opinion art. Great elitist art, capable of creating beautiful and extraordinary things. Magic is a talent granted to only a chosen few. Others, deprived of talent, can only look at the results of artists' works with admiration and envy, can admire the finished work, while feeling that without these creations and without this talent, the world would be a poorer place. The fact that following the conjunction of the spheres, some chosen few discovered talent and magic within themselves. The fact that they found art within themselves is a blessing of beauty. And that's how it is. Those who believe that magic is art is also right. So now we've got two different perspectives on magic. And then she gives another one. There are also those according to whom magic is a science. In order to master it, talent and innate ability are not enough. Years of keen study and arduous work are essential. Endurance and self-discipline are necessary. Magic acquired like this is knowledge, learning, the limits of which are constantly stretched by enlightened and vigorous minds, by experience, experiments, and practice. Magic acquired in such a way is progress. It is the plow, the loom, the watermill, the smelting furnace, the winch and the pulley. It is progress, evolution, change. It is constant movement upwards towards improvement, towards the stars. The fact that following the conjunction of the spheres, we discovered magic will one day allow us to reach the stars. Those who consider magic to be a science are also right. Remember that, Ciri, and now come to me. Remember, magic is chaos, art, and science. It is a curse, a blessing, and a progress. It depends on who uses magic, how they use it, and to what purpose. And magic is everywhere, all around us, easily accessible. So she's engaging in kind of an info dump about the world, a very important lesson that shows us the depth of Yennefer's intellect and her willingness to pass things on, in some ways unselfishly, to Ciri. And, you know, Geralt, Ciri, his daughter of sorts, Yennefer, become kind of a family, don't they? Along with Triss and Dandelion, as you might say, younger brother, younger sister, being all connected in some kind of destined unit. I'll just bring up 2 or 3 other things. There's a beautiful, love scene between them, which is not pornographic at all, and is quite romantic without being sappy. I'll just read one line of this that Sapkowski has in here. They found one another, conquered their fear, and a moment later found the truth which exploded under their eyelids with a terrible blinding clarity, tore apart the lips pursed in determination with a moan. The time shuddered spasmodically and froze. Everything vanished, and touch became the only functioning sense. What a wonderful description. Now, immediately after that, Yennefer says, "You want to build a home?" Geralt was quiet. He was angry with himself, as he had been thinking for her, he had accidentally allowed her to read a thought about herself. A pretty dream, said Yennefer, stroking him lightly on the shoulder. A home, a house built with your own hands. And you and I in that house, you would keep horses and sheep, and I would have a little garden, cook food and card wool, which we would take to market. With the pennies earned from selling the wood and various crops, we would buy what we needed. Let's say some copper cauldrons and an iron rake. Every now and then, Ciri would visit with her husband and 3 children, and Tris Marigold would occasionally look in to stay for a few days. We'd grow old together beautifully and with dignity, and should I ever get bored, you would play for me in the evening on your homemade bagpipes. Playing the bagpipes, as everyone knows, is the best remedy for depression. This is not a life available for them, but, they have something else as well. Now, the time of Contempt ends with Ciri having escaped from this and this and this and this and survived, eventually joining this band of robbers called the Rats. And we get a long description of the different members of the gang. They were outcasts. They were a strange mixed bag created by war, misfortune, and contempt. War, misfortune, and contempt had brought them together and thrown them onto the bank in the way that a river in flood throws and deposits drifting black pieces of wood smoothed by stones onto its bank. And they fight against all the different peoples and patrols and things like that. Here's another description. They didn't take long to find each other in the merry crowd. Too much distinguished them. They had too much in common. They were united by their love of gaudy, colorful, fanciful outlets, of stolen trinkets, beautiful horses, and swords, which they didn't even unfasten when they danced. They stood out because of their arrogance and conceit, overconfidence, mocking truculence, and impetuousness, and their contempt. They were children of the time of contempt, and they had nothing but contempt for others. For them only force mattered, skill at wielding weapons, which they quickly acquired on the high roads, resoluteness, swift horses and sharp swords, and companions, comrades, mates, because the one who is alone will perish from hunger, from the sword, from the arrow, from makeshift peasant clubs, from the noose or in flames. So, they become a band of rats, and, then who joins them? Until the day a pale-haired, taciturn girl as agile as an acrobat appeared, a girl about whom the rats knew nothing, aside from the fact that she was as they had once been, like each one of them, lonely and full of bitterness for what the time of contempt had taken from her, and in times of contempt anyone who is alone must perish. Giselher, Kale, Reef, Iskra, Missile, Asa, and Falca. The prefect of Amarula was inordinately astonished when he learned that the rats were now operating as a gang of 7. And the book ends with a soldier talking about running into the 7th and a discussion about looking for this girl, looking for Ciri, who's being, there's rewards offered for her. She has joined the rats. She has become one of them. And that is where this the 4th book ends and the rest of the novels begin. But that's enough for this. You see how important these other characters do become. We're no longer just a circus tent with one main pole. We have Yennefer, just as important in many respects as Geralt. We have Dandelion, his close friend and companion. We have Tris, Marigold, and we have at the center of everything by the end, Ciri. As is proving so often the case, we're not going to get to every one of the philosophical themes I had originally intended to talk about. We consumed a lot of time going through passages in the books, and there's no bad part about that, except for the fact that we're not going to talk about one of the big themes that I've mentioned already, but wanted to go much further into. That is the rivalries and tensions between all the different races of hominids on the continent. But good news is we will talk about that perhaps in the follow-up session right after this video finishes premiering, and we'll definitely talk about it the next time around that we go into the Witcher universe, which will be definitely happening next year in the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series as we go through the 4 remaining novels, one of which is a prequel talking about the Witcher series. What I do want to say as we close this up is this entire Witcher series and Sapkowski's oeuvre as a totality is something that was suggested by fans of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction series. I'm always a little skeptical, a little bit hesitant. This time, the recommendation, as has been so often the case with many of the previous authors, turned out to be really quite wonderful. And so, to all of you who voted for Sapkowski's Witcher back when we were, polling and voting about who we ought to do next in Worlds of Speculative Fiction, let me just say thank you. And I'm going to leave off here and hope that you'll join me for future sessions where we're going to cover many other great authors in speculative fiction and eventually come around to Sapkowski's Witcher series again.